This is Writing Lessons, and I'm your host, Silas House. In each episode of Writing Lessons, we look at a different topic of creative writing, and today we're focusing on plot. Our guest for this episode is, in my opinion, a master of plot. Gwenda Bond is the New York Times bestselling author of many books, including her most recent, The Frame Up, a magical art heist novel. Other books include the first official Stranger Things tie-in novel, the young adult Lois Lane series, and the Cirque Americaine series. Gwenda is also a great contributor to creating community among writers, which is so important, including being a founder and the current chair of the Lexington Writers Room. She's a native of southeastern Kentucky, like me, and also like me, she now lives in Lexington. I'm always glad to be in conversation with her. Thanks for being with us, Gwenda.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm always glad to be in conversation with you.
Well, writers worry so much about plot, but I tend to think that if I work on my characters and I build them and know what they want, the plot will arise on its own. Do you subscribe to that notion, or do you go about it in a different way?
Stories tend to come to me with a character and a situation almost simultaneously.
Hmm.
But I do tend more towards, even though I'm kind of, I think, considered more of a plot heavy writer. I can't plot without the character.
Well,
I really do work from the character, and I think that that determines everything that happens in a story, ideally. So absolutely, I agree with you.
yes, I think that's why you are so good at plot because you go at it from character. And I find that a lot of times beginning writers they are working so hard on plot that it sort of is a self-fulfilling prophecy that it sort of freaks them out to the point they can't get it written, right?
Absolutely. My tip for beginning writers and for all writers actually, and this was, I think, maybe my breakthrough realization, because I used to do that, and it's like if I can figure out what happens, then I can tell a story. And it's like, well, that's just what happens. That's not who it happens to. That's not where the meaning comes from. And so my rule of thumb is if you could substitute another character into your story and the same things would happen, then you haven't done enough work on your character to
That's
be
great.
able to develop a plot.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that for me, one thing that's so important is knowing what my character wants.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's about, trying to figure out if they're going to get that or not.
Right, right. And how they're preventing themselves from getting it.
Right. Exactly. That's the interesting part.
Yeah,
But also I think sometimes people confuse story with plot.
I agree.
And the thing is, just about everybody can tell a story, right? Because I mean, it's like ingrained in us from the time we're infants. We're told stories, we hear them every day of our lives.
Mhm.
But being a writer is very different than being a storyteller.
Yep.
And so I think that writers need to think a lot about craft and
Yes.
and how you have to craft a story to to make it into a piece of writing and not just a story. And I don't mean to negate stories in any way or storytelling. I'm just saying
Right.
it's a whole different entity.
Absolutely. I mean, we grow up with stories where you can skip large sections,
Mhm.
right? And in what in some ways we would consider in a written work, the actual journey, right? You elide because you're focusing on just these high points. And I think that is part of the difficulty when you first start writing, is that you haven't necessarily practiced telling those parts in an interesting way. You just leave them out. And of course, you can try leaving out, all the parts that you would skip or whatever.
Mhm.
To quote another writer, but you need the connective tissue in order to take the reader on a journey. And so I feel like it's all interconnected. It's what points can you not go on the same journey with the character without experiencing them as a reader, you know?
Mhm. Right. Well, how much do you think about things like propulsion and pacing when you're writing? Or is that something you think more about in revision or what? Or at all?
Um, I think I started out when I first got serious about writing screenplays, even though I was a reader and a lover of books first. And so I do think that's part of why I'm good at plot because you learn all the have to learn how to do the plot arc. You have to learn how to do all the character work externally. And so
Mhm.
the learning curve for me was really learning how to put that internal piece on the page. And so I think I naturally am pretty good at pacing. And so what I end up doing is going back in and layering all of the rest on top of kind of the what is happening in the story.
Yeah, that is so important, isn't it? What's happening on the surface is one thing, but
Right.
really what makes a good book is what's happening beneath the surface and all those layers. That
Yeah.
that that too is sort of the difference between a story, which can be more surface, and a piece of writing in that way that it has to have those layers.
Absolutely. And I don't know many writers who can conjure every layer at once. So I think that's another thing, when you are a beginning writer, you might think, well, I wrote that scene and that scene is done, but I
Mhm.
don't know about what your daily routine is like. But even when I'm working on a first draft that I know is going to change, I'm working over a scene
Yeah.
several times.
Oh,
Um at least.
yes. Well, growing up, I read a lot of stuff like Stephen King and a lot of real commercial fiction, and I really am thankful for that. I feel like it was such an education, especially in plot, to the point that I don't have to think a whole lot about plot. Like we were saying, if you
Yep.
create your character, the plot will arise, etc. But I do think some of that comes from reading heavily plotted work as a young reader and young writer. So the main one I can point to is Stephen King. Are there any
Mhm.
particular writers or books that you feel gave you a foundation as for plot?
I also read a lot of Stephen King, and I do think he's kind of a master of character and plot. So it's no surprise that he was an influence on both of us. And I agree, genre fiction. And I'll tell you, as an adult, one of the best tutorials and I always tell writing students this because someone in my grad program said read 100 romance novels, and
Hmm.
you'll learn a lot about how to put emotion on the page and how to make a compelling plot because they are automatically, the end point is a happy ever after. And yet these books are page turners. And that is a masterful trick. That is something that takes a really high level of craft. So I feel like genre fiction, though, any genre you can absorb. I feel like those things. And, as you get more advanced, like my latest novel was a heist novel. I studied heist stories, before I started writing it because I just wanted to internalize the rules and figure out what worked for me in a heist story and what I didn't care for that much. Um, and so I do think like if you're trying to write a certain kind of story, it always helps to be an expert in what has been done, so that you can take it further in your direction.
Right. You just said something. You paid attention to what you didn't like as much,
Yes.
and I think that's important. I'm always telling beginning writers or writers period to write the book they want to read.
Yes.
And I think, anytime that if you were trying to shape a book to check off as many boxes as possible and as big an audience as possible and all that, it's never going to work. It has to
It'll
just
be
be
terrible.
right.
Yeah.
It has to be the story you want to tell
That's
and,
right.
and that you care about. So the way you said that, I think solidifies that. Well, when I'm teaching writing, I often tell students about the CCCR method. Now, this is conflict, complications, crisis resolution. It's not something I think about constantly while I'm writing, but if I'm doing my job correctly, that will happen organically. So, conflict, basically the trouble, right? Complications is the way the trouble manifests for the character. And then crisis is like the point where it all comes to a head. And then the resolution is, how this goes. do they live happily ever after or not?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, are you thinking about devices like that at all when you're writing, or is it all just totally organic for you by now?
If I wish it was all totally organic. I'm always thinking and overthinking when I'm working. And usually when I turn to things like that, it's when I'm either having trouble or when I'm deep in the weeds. A lot of times I just talk those things out with writer friends, and that will solve things. I always encourage people to articulate your problem out loud, because a lot of times you'll solve it. Um, but I will say, every time I'm finishing a book, about 80% in, I buy a book about how to write a book and read it rapidly to
Mhm.
make sure that I know what I'm doing. Because by that point, I'm convinced that I have forgotten everything I know and will never finish it. And of course, it's like, oh, this is just part of my process now.
You know
So I
what?
do think that.
I think that's so important to have that doubt. I mean,
Yeah.
I have published 7 novels, and every one of them has been hard. Every one
Yeah.
of them I have thought this is awful. It'll never get published. And
Yep.
so I think that sort of doubt is fuel for us as artists.
Absolutely. If I was too certain about it, I would not trust it at all.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope Woofy, by the way, my dog is in here chewing a bone, and I hope it's not too loud.
Dogs are always welcome on this show. So whatever Whoopi wants to do. Um, so do you outline or what's your process that way?
It depends. I had to learn how to master outlining from doing work like the Stranger Things book and the Lois Lane
Mhm.
books, because when you work with those folks, they want to know exactly what's going to happen, more or less. And it is helpful for you to know that they are going to expect what you give them in the end. It avoids a lot of pain and suffering.
Right.
But it really was that's how I sort of had my realizations about character based plotting, because I really felt like I had a good handle on the characters. And as I developed those, then doing the outline was much easier. So I tend to do outlining more. Every book is different. I tend to do outlining more now in revision, so that I can
Mhm.
make a thorough plan and I know exactly what I'm going to change, because that's kind of where the clarity piece is. I'd say I outline a few chapters in advance a little bit, but I don't try to come up with every specific thing that's going to happen. For me, what works is to have a sense of what needs or is going to happen, so that then when I'm writing, my brain can be creative in figuring out the how in the moment. If I'm trying to figure out the what and the how, that's where I get stuck. So I try to sit down and have at least a little bit of an idea of where we're going that day.
I do almost the exact same thing. Like you said earlier, I think it's when I get in trouble that these sort of devices come in
Mm-hmm.
handy more than when I'm starting out or things like that. It's
Yeah.
like sometimes I have to reassess. And when I do, I sort of bring in these things that I've been taught
Mm-hmm.
to sort of allow myself to check the work
Yeah.
and apply those rules. It's sort of like you have to know the rules to break them. You know,
Yes.
I think in creative writing, often people they don't want rules and they don't want a lot of structured stuff and things like that. But you have to have it to some degree so that you know how to not use
Oh,
it and when to use it, right?
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. To me, the biggest one of the biggest risks of when you first start out is that you can imagine so many ways your story goes, right? And I
Hmm.
think as you keep writing, you develop more of a sense of what's the story that I want to tell. Why am I writing this book?
Hmm.
Because every choice is not available to you once you narrow down what you actually want to do. And so I always say choices are your best friend. Like if I've decided roughly, like I'm writing in this genre and I'm writing this, then that narrows the number of choices, and you can really focus on making the ones that fit what you're trying to do as well developed as possible. Because you can really get in a pickle if you just are. I always ask people when they're getting ready to make giant change and a revision, are you doing this because it will make the story better, or are you doing it and it will just make it different?
One of the main questions I'm always asking is, does this serve
Mm-hmm.
what I'm trying to do? Does this serve the story? Does this serve the book? Or, do I just really want to do this?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Everything has, I think, I will often think, well, will the whole thing collapse if I take this out? And
Mm.
if it won't, then I don't, absolutely need it. Um,
I think that's a great question. I'm going to totally steal that.
yeah, you're welcome to it. Um, well, do you have any kind of ceremonies around writing? Or like, are there perfect conditions for you when you're writing?
Honestly, my favorite way to write is outside, on the
Yeah, me
porch.
too.
And I have a lot of little devices that don't have the internet or that have small screens.
Mhm.
And so my most productive times are probably sitting outside with the dogs running around, interrupting periodically, typing without being distracted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I call my dogs my writing assistants because they're always right by me and I need that energy, you know?
Yeah. 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 I mean, I will go to the writer's room and there's a different kind of energy there. Like you get the energy of all the other people if they're around, or just the idea that
Mm.
you're in this space that's sort of designed for creativity and focus. And I do some great revision work there where, you're just really locked in for hours at a time. But I do sometimes sneak the dogs in there as well.
Right. Can you briefly explain what the Lexington Writers Room is for somebody may want to do it in their community?
Sure. Yeah, it is a space that we created that's open 24/7 just for writers to write. And so there's lots of plants, there's lots of colorful things, there's lots of like big monitors you can plug into, office supplies. And really it's just meant to be a community hub, but most of all a place where writers can go and write, because not everyone has a good space that's conducive to writing. And also I really feel like community so important to writers, and also being allowed to take yourself seriously when you're first starting out, I think can be a real challenge because your family may not get it and they may not see it as work. So being able to go to a place where the communication is what you're doing is important, no matter what stage you're at, I think is one of the beautiful things I hope the writers room does.
Yeah, I know people who are members who say that, when they need community, community is there for them in
Yeah.
that way. But when they need to go there and just be quiet and,
Yeah.
that is real easy to achieve too. So it's like you can have whatever experience you want.
Yeah, well, and our good friend David Arnold said a thing on a panel he and I were on recently, that was basically when he's finished projects there, it feels more special because he feels in a way like it's a committed community effort, even though you're working alone. And I just thought that was one of the coolest things I'd ever heard.
Yeah, yeah. It is such a stereotype, that we do this all like tucked up in an attic all alone and all that. But that's one thing that I'm an evangelist about is that writers need a community. And also,
Yes,
when you are in a community with writers, you have a shorthand with each other, and it's just a special kind of
it
community and
is.
love. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you're one of the few writers I know who writes full time. Can you talk about being a full time writer and sort of the pros and cons of that?
Well, if you like getting paid regularly, it can be it can be a nail biter at times. If your life goes haywire, it can be difficult because if you shift things around too much, then your payment schedule gets all screwed up. And I mean, it is a constant hustle. On the other hand, it's very motivating to know that it's not really a choice. You have to sit down and do the work, and I feel very fortunate. I've been really lucky, and I do feel that living here, where we have a low cost of living and such a great vibrant community, is pretty ideal for a writer. And I had a day job for many many years, so I'm keenly aware that it's ridiculous that I sometimes had an easier time getting my work done when I had a full time job, because sometimes when you have all this time, it's really easy to like fritter it away doing this or that, or creating a nonprofit or whatever things you do to procrastinate. Um, but I do feel like I'm able to be more deliberate and just have more time for living and breathing now. But it certainly can be. I do say like it depends on your temperament. Like if you can't deal with uncertainty, you shouldn't even consider that an outcome that you want, because
Right.
it's not something where every day you're going to be like, I know exactly what's going to happen, and I know exactly how this book's going to do, and I know that I'll be able to sell the next one.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we never know that. We never know.
Exactly, you never know, so you just have to always be like, well, I'm glad I get to do this for now.
Yep. Well, if you could recommend one of your books to our listeners, which one would it be?
I guess the most recent, the frame up, especially because we're talking about plot, and I think
Mhm.
heist stories are some of the most difficult. It definitely was one of the most moving parts of any book that I've ever done, and I think it's my most Kentucky book.
Yeah,
And it is filled with all these things I love, like art history and magic, and but also works in the real world. So I think it can appeal to readers who like a little bit of magic in their storytelling, and those who prefer real world magic.
I would second that. I think the frame up is just masterfully plotted,
You.
and I would recommend it for anybody who wants to learn how to create vivid characters. I mean, on the very first page, you understand that character, and so
Thank
it's
you.
such a beautiful book. So yeah, everybody out there read that. Before I let you go, you mentioned earlier that you had done some screenwriting, and I know that you love film. I do
Hmm.
too, and I think film has been it's such an important part of my writing process. When I am writing a novel, I I avoid other novels that are sort of similar in theme or
Hmm.
whatever, but I go to films that are similar and I
Yeah.
sort of luxuriate in them. Why do you love film so much as from a writer's point of view?
Well, I think visual storytelling is so potent, right? I think I've just always connected with visual arts, and I do think as a writer, when we watch films, we're because books are the only place that I say where you can really experience the inside of another person. That's the magic that they
Mhm.
can do that nothing else can do. We bring kind of that lens and overlay that. So I feel like when writers watch movies, we do it in a little bit of a different way, even than film students. Like we're
Yes.
absorbing the visual storytelling, but we're also able to kind of project that rich inner landscape if the movie's really working for us. And I love it. I mean, I mean, film is I know you and I share a love of old movies
Mhm.
and all movies really, from different eras. And I just think, just like genres of books, you take away like different things and they have different pleasures. And they just feel like they're always in conversation to me,
Right.
the two.
Yeah, that's something I often recommend to writers is to consume all the art you can.
Yes.
When I'm
Yes.
working on a novel, and I know you're this way too, like I'm looking at paintings, I'm looking at
Yes.
photographs, I'm listening
Listening to
to music.
music.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think people can just be a little narrow in thinking, oh, they can only like read books to learn how to be a better writer. I think
Oh,
consuming
yeah.
art makes us better artists.
Oh, absolutely. And also like your visual vocabulary. I mean, I really recommend people go wander through galleries, and if I'm
Mhm.
stuck, that's where I go. I go find any art show. If you can find one painting that moves you to look at, somehow it will unstick your brain a lot of times.
Right. Well, thank you so much for all these tips. These are great writing lessons
Well,
for
thank
folks.
you.
And as you know, I love your work and I love you too. So,
Back at you.
all right. Thanks. We'll see you soon. Writing Lessons is an initiative of the 2024-2025 Kentucky Poet Laureate. That's me, Silas House. I'm thankful for the support of the Kentucky Arts Council, the Carnegie Center for Literacy and Learning, the Office of Governor Andy Beshear, and Kentucky Humanities. This show is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me. I hope you will share the show with other writers, students, or anyone who is interested in the creative process. Please subscribe to our show And if you like it, I hope you'll leave a review or a 5-star rating. That'll help us get the show to more listeners. Thanks so much for listening to Writing Lessons.